Hello and welcome to this episode of The Art and Design of Sci-Fi and Fantasy, Mystery and Horror. Today I speak with Jonathan Risner about his recent book on Argentine horror cinema. We talk about what Argentine horror cinema is, how it's made, how it's distributed, some of the elements that it involves. Argentina had a long and brutal dictatorship up until relatively recently in the modern era, and we talk about how that may or may not have affected how Argentina horror is created and what they include in their horror. So definitely interesting for any horror fans, anyone interested in cinema in general, Latin American cinema, definitely. So yeah, good stuff. Thank you and enjoy. I'm speaking with Assistant Professor Jonathan Risner, author of Blood Circuits, Contemporary Argentine Horror Cinema. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
So first, tell me, how did you get into studying and writing about this subject?
Oh, wow. It's a bit of a long story, but I'll try to be concise. So I guess if you go back to 2005, 2006, it was during the, I guess what's still going on, the War on Terror, and I was taking a class where I was in graduate school, and the class was about memory and how novels and films and numerous other kinds of media, commemorate different events, maybe more often than not, unfortunately, tragedies. Mm-hmm. And something that struck me at that time was in U.S. Popular culture, a lot of the movies and television shows that were coming out about the War on Terror, what was going on in Afghanistan and Iraq and the United States, most of those movies were failing. And television shows were failing, and most of those that were failing were melodramas, dramas. But what kind of struck me as strange is what was popular was Eli Roth's Hostel, which isn't necessarily a political film, but it has some elements to it that bring up some things that were happening. So I was struck by that, and then the news and internet news on I guess the website format for a Hollywood industrial magazine called Variety. There was an article written about Argentine horror cinema, and I'd never heard about an Argentine horror film ever being made. So I was immediately struck by, well, how do you make a horror film and not remember, not reference, or even escape a very real tragedy that happened in that country from 1976 to 1983. Mm-hmm. And during that time, there was a dictatorship, the last dictatorship it's oftentimes called. And during that time, it's been estimated about 30,000 people were killed, disappeared in pretty brutal ways. There were torture centers in the country. And so again, my question was, how do you make a horror film? And nowadays, well, it's almost a given that horror films are going to have, not always, but frequently have a kidnapping or some kind of type of captivity or torture. And so I was, the question that struck me was, how do you make a film without bringing up that past and without critics taking a director to task for even dealing with that kind of violence in a society that has a history of very real violence. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what attracted me to the project originally. And then as I dug deeper, there are more and more interesting things.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So tell me a little bit about this book.
So the book was originally a dissertation project when I was in graduate school, and based on the criticism I got about the dissertation, I transformed the dissertation to a book. And also there were newer films that were made since I finished the dissertation. So I finished the dissertation in, 2012. and there were new films made. So yeah, I included those new films and try to expand it and take into account some new things that are happening with the movies.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, something that I was kind of struck me about Argentine horror cinema was that, there's not much of a tradition of Argentine horror cinema. In the preceding, I guess, Argentine horror cinema kind of came into its own at the end of the 1990s, and prior to that, throughout, I'd say like the 1910s up through 1970s and 80s, horror cinema was often considered a genre that was most often associated with the United States or England with the Hammer films, or Italy or Spain with Jesus Franco's films. So that was something interesting about it. But a lot of the directors who are making horror films or who have made horror films in Argentina are heavily influenced by U.S. directors from the 80s. So John Carpenter is one that constantly comes up. Sam Raimi is another. And they're not strictly influenced by horror film directors, but those are kind of the usual suspects. But also Japanese horror, and Dario Argento's films also exercise some influence. So what was happening at the end of the 1990s, and what has changed kind of over the past, I'd say 5 or 7 years, is that a lot of the films that were made at the end of the 1990s were kind of, for lack of a better term, I don't want to use this pejoratively, but kind of amateur films, in the sense that they weren't commercial films that were released in cinemas. So something that's that doesn't happen in the United States, but does happen in a lot of other countries, is that the government in Argentina is heavily involved with commercial film production at all kinds of different levels. And in short, if the government doesn't support your film, then your film's not going to be shown in commercial cinema. And government involvement can be at any kinds of levels. It's not like a heavy subsidy, but it does help film production. So again, in the 1990s, people are making these movies, and a lot of these folks have gone to film schools and they have training, but they're making films that, films for like $100, $20, $1,000, $2,000, not high budgets at all, and they're releasing the films on YouTube, different sites, relying on kind of the informal economy in Argentina, and some of them are great movies. They're great, and so what has changed over the past, I'd say 10 years now. Starting in 2008, the Argentine government started supporting the production of horror films, and it's gotten steadily. It's created this kind of sustained rhythm of commercial horror films, and they've gotten released in cinemas, and some of them are fared better than others, and some of the films have been released in the United States on DVD, or I think one film was released in New York in cinemas. So it's kind of interesting what's happening now is a few of the films, like 3 or 4 of them, are available on Netflix, I think Argentine horror cinema is kind of coming into its own as for its sustained production. There's not like a single film that defines it, something like The Ring from Japan, but rather there's a sustained rhythm of production that's happening.
Yeah, actually, before this interview, I went online and saw an Argentine horror short. I think it was released pretty recently. It was pretty intense. It felt different from other things I've seen in the U.S. It just had well, for one, it felt almost European. Okay. It had sort of I forget the title. I'm sure if you just Google or on YouTube, just search for Argentine horror films. It's a recent short one, but it just felt like it was exploring things in a different way. And if you have low budget, you're going to try to focus on better ideas and that sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. And it's an interesting tension sometimes, and it happens all over the globe. And not that all cinema has to be kind of nationalistic in some ways, but the non-U.S. cinema is oftentimes living in the shadow of Hollywood. It's not all directors do this, but it's a question of imitating and using what works, but also trying to carve out something that's a little different, to avoid complete repetition. And some of the directors make interesting things, and I could talk more about that, but
I'd like you to discuss some of the themes that you talk about in the book. I mean, I don't know if you focus just on the elements themselves, or if you talk about the symbolism of stuff that are in these films.
Oh, yeah. Well, the first chapter deals with kind of an overview of what I call Argentine horror film culture, and basically that idea is the idea of a film culture for me is what people do with films. So whether that be making film fan art, or tweeting about a film, or going to a film festival and watching a movie and talking about it with their friends, what people do with an Argentine horror film creates a culture around those films. So the first chapter is kind of a way to tie in everything, and I talk about Argentine horror film culture in Argentina, as well as outside Argentina. So the name of the book is Blood Circuits. So the idea is that there's these horror films, and it's just not Argentine horror films, but other horror films, and they circulate all over the globe now. There are people who are interested in horror films, and not just because they're from a particular country, but they find them interesting for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as Argentine horror film culture goes, in Argentina, I just kind of give an overview of film festivals there, and websites and blogs and conventions, production companies, funding mechanisms, I guess, and then I go beyond Argentina and talk about who's paying attention to Argentine horror cinema outside of Argentina.
Mm-hmm.
So websites like used to be called Twitch, but now it's Screen Anarchy.
Mm-hmm.
But also other websites that are commonly known to horror film fans, like Bloody Disgusting or Dread Central. But also horror film, those sites are in the United States, but also sites that are in Japan and Germany and England and Italy.
Mm-hmm.
Those sites that are for horror cinema, those folks are also aware of the horror films as well. But in addition to kind of media coverage of those films, there's also kind of horror film festivals in all kinds of countries that create kind of circuit for these films. So horror film festivals or fantasy film festivals like Cites in Spain,
mm-hmm.
or Macabro in Mexico, there's one in South Korea, one in Belgium. So these places where these films can go, and they attract attention, and that creates a kind of horror film culture. And so from there, I kind of focus on particular films and organize each section according to themes. So the next chapter kind of deals with, for lack of a better word, space. So in Argentina, let me see if I can be concise about this. And it's the same in the United States in some ways, and it plays out in U.S. film as well. But in Argentina, I could say starting from its independence in 1810, 1812,
mm-hmm.
There's this conception of city versus country. So the city is the civilized space, and the country is the savage place.
Mm.
And it's this kind of dichotomy that doesn't always hold true, and it doesn't always hold true in all Argentine films.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking at the horror films as a way to kind of get around that. So I look at a zombie film and how space looks like in the zombie film. So there's a suburb of Buenos Aires where a famous zombie film takes place called Plaga Zombie, and folks can watch it on YouTube. It probably is the most popular Argentine horror film, probably the second one, Plaga Zombies on Mutante, and it's great. And then I look at another film that is a rape revenge film that takes place in the country, in the countryside, and it's brutal. It's a brutal film. And I also look at a film that takes place in also a suburb. And in some ways, this is just considering these films initially as just something different. It's not all about the city and the country, and the city being civilized and the country being savage, but there's kind of different things going on. The other thing, so the next chapter, one of the other things that I deal with is are films. This is something that really kind of surprised me when I started looking at this topic, is that Argentine horror films that are filmed with English language dialogue. So I try to be brief, but when I really started looking into this topic, I went to Buenos Aires and was doing interviews with directors and film festival programmers and journalists, and I became aware of these horror films that were made in Argentina by Argentine directors, usually with Argentine actors, and they were speaking an accent of English and trying to make some section of the city or outside of the city make it look like the United States. And there's this bizarre dynamic, and what was happening is that they're making these films for the B movie market in the United States. And the films were usually on extremely low budgets, and they were getting distribution in the United States and other countries, and a lot of these films can be seen on YouTube. What was at that moment with these films, the Argentine government was not supporting them, so it was a way for directors to make films, to ply their trade and to have their films seen. So these films are getting distributed in the United States legally, and I was going to say that they were circulating in Argentina illegally. So through informal markets and file sharing, but they didn't have distribution in the United States. The films in Argentina, distribution in the United States, sometimes other countries like Germany and Sweden, and there's a way for these folks to get their name out there. So that was something that was interesting to me as I look at those movies, and so I think something else that's really interesting is that Hollywood cinema dominates in Argentina. Argentines oftentimes prefer they go to the cinema to see a U.S. film over an Argentine film. But oftentimes the production values are better. So you have that, and for some of those directors, it's a, you know, in some ways it's a losing battle if you want to look at that. But it's just these Argentine English language films show how Argentines, in this case Argentine directors, know U.S. horror cinema, U.S. B horror cinema oftentimes so well that they can make a film for the B film market in the United States successfully and get distribution. That was something totally different than I had encountered. Other sections of the book, another section I talk about punk horror cinema, which is this incredibly raw punk cinema that is purposefully offensive, and the horror kind of sneaks in there with gore. And so I talk about that. Another section, and then I think then the last section, last chapter of the book, which I think is in some ways the most compelling, just given the attention to cinema from Argentina. Oftentimes critics from the popular image of Argentine cinema, and this is not horror cinema, but Argentine cinema in general, is that a lot of it has to do with the last dictatorship, and that's true in a lot of ways. The government supported a lot of films after the dictatorship as a way of dealing with the legacy, but also as a way of exporting a kind of image of the country that shows that, you know, that they're aware of their past, in short. And so yeah, that's kind of one thing I had to deal with. So again, getting back to what I was saying earlier about what attracted me to the project, I went down when I went to interview a lot of directors in Argentina. One of my questions, which I tried to be as most respectful as possible, is, you know, I asked them, you know, when you make these kinds of movies, when you have the kidnapping or when you have this torture scene, like, does this have to do with what happened in the last dictatorship? They say, oh, no, not at all. So again, it's my expectation, because so many Argentine films deal with the last dictatorship. My initial expectation was, well, these horror films have to be about the dictatorship, and for the directors, it was nothing like that. So I talk about that, but I also talk about some horror films. Ones that have been supported by the government and have a high budget, but also some low budget ones that really explicitly deal with the dictatorship in different ways. And for me, that was a way to get at the idea that generations remember differently. So immediately after the dictatorship in 84, 85, and on, the most common film genre that dealt with the dictatorship was a melodramas and documentaries. And there are some film critics, Argentine film critics, who said that was the appropriate way to deal with such a raw memory. You know, that, you know, society wasn't so far removed from that time, that a melodrama and a documentary are kind of, how should I say it, dissident or ethical ways of dealing with a tragedy. And so, but you fast forward, say, like, let me see here, almost, 25, 30 years, a different generation of filmmakers are using horror cinema to deal with it, to deal with legacies of the last dictatorship. And it's oftentimes it's not just about gore, but also oftentimes it's a question of combining horror cinema with comedy.
Interesting.
So there's different ways, different generations deal with memories in different ways, and for me, the horror cinema was a way to consider that. So yeah.
So you've I just want to ask this quick question. So you've named a few films. I assume that anyone interested in getting into Argentine horror and the punk horror, I assume that your book has many of the films listed that people could track down. And I don't want you to name them because I want people to buy the book, to check it out.
Yeah.
But you do have that.
Yeah, it's in the back. There's a filmography, and as folks read along in the chapters, they'll see that. But the filmography should list the distributors in the United States. And when the films are available on YouTube, I list that they're on YouTube. So yeah, the stuff's out there, and shouldn't be too hard to get. Yeah, there was, I think some of this it might be an acquired taste, but some films are they are what they are. We have low budgets, and some people might say they stink. But then when you understand a movie is made for $200, then that could change someone's mind. So yeah. Anyway.
So how many different films did you review for this book, and how many interviews did you do? Would you say about?
Oh, goodness. The number of films I looked at, probably 30, 35, 40. Just trying to think. But I was also looking at horror films that were made before this period. Yeah, so I'm going to give a more conservative estimate, probably say 30, maybe 30, 35. As far as the interview goes, including Facebook interviews, I would say probably about 25, 30 interviews.
Mm-hmm.
People were really gracious with their time and willingness to answer my questions. So yeah, it was a good project, good undertaking, and folks who are involved with the film production, or just our film festivals, or our journalists were really helpful in sending me the right direction. Although I can't blame them for any errors. So, yeah.
Right. So, what part of the research was most enjoyable?
Oh goodness. Oh gosh. I think what I would say, like what I just said about people's willingness to be accessible. I was surprised by that. I think I owe Mark Zuckerberg a beer for Facebook, because there were a number of times where I didn't know where to begin, and I would just on a whim type in a director's name into Facebook or into Google, and if they had a personal website, I'd contact them through their personal website. But oftentimes I would contact them through Facebook, and these folks would respond, and I was able to meet them at like cafes or just to restaurants and do the interviews there, or to chat with them through Facebook. And I think that was pretty rewarding and downright humbling to see folks who are willing to meet with someone they didn't know. About a mutual interest. So yeah, I think that was probably the most rewarding thing.
So what would you say was the most surprising thing you discovered in your research? Maybe something you haven't mentioned already.
Goodness, let me think about this. I think that I think the thing that I mentioned before about the films not being about the last dictatorship, that was surprising. I think something else that was surprising as well was the determination of these filmmakers. A lot of these folks, they have some formal film training and sometimes not. But without any kind of support, especially for the films, but also with the films that do have some support from some private companies and from the government. It's not a huge budget, but their inventiveness to make their own special effects and to wear many hats with the production of the film. So with the films that are made on shoestring budgets and without commercial distribution, if you watch the end credits, like, the director is oftentimes the script writer, the camera person, and plays multiple characters in the movie. And that happens. And it's impressive to see these folks' determination to make a movie. This is kind of mawkish, kind of over sentimental, but there's a portion of the book, I think in the introduction, where I call these films a constellation of miracles, because they're realizing these movies, these feature-length movies, on budgets that are just that are extremely low. But they're making the movies, so it's my hats are off to them. So yeah,
that's cool. So what was the most difficult part of the research? And that could be a difficult film to track down, or director to find, or just some issue to solve.
Let's see. One thing that seems kind of minor now, in retrospect, I was trying to get rights for a image for the cover of the book, and it didn't work out. And with one image, and I found another one, and that was okay. Otherwise, I mean, there was one director I was trying to track down, and he responded once, and then it couldn't. And I thought things were going to work out, and it didn't work out. It happens. So he was gracious enough to respond first, but that was okay. I think I think those are kind of the bigger problems, but, I guess the bigger problem also, too, was just planning the book and laying it out in a way that it would be coherent.
Mm-hmm.
Because in some ways, Argentine horror cinema is not coherent.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just because the movies all come from the same country, or the directors come from the same country,
mm-hmm.
One might expect to find kind of a style that has repeated across the different films.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of a question that came up in the interviews, and sometimes is like, what makes Argentine horror cinema different from other films from elsewhere? Which is also, which is kind of an unfair question, because, horror films from the United States aren't all the same.
Right.
But an answer that did come up that was kind of interesting was from, I think, at least one director, was Argentine horror film directors making do with more limited budgets. So, a limited budget film, a horror film made on a small budget in the United States might be something like Your Next, Adam Wingard's The Next, which is made for $1 million, and for a horror film in Argentina at $1 million, it'd be like, that would be amazing. So yeah.
Was there anything you discovered that emotionally moved you, and that could be either negatively or positively or just in any way?
Oh man, I think what kind of well, gosh, this is kind of hard to capture in a concise way, but I think the legacy of the dictatorship
mm-hmm.
Was something that was tough for me to deal with,
mm-hmm.
And not just with the directors. I mean, they helped me understand the different dynamics in the country. So,
mm-hmm.
Not the entire country doesn't remember in a uniform way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes you have people who are born after the dictatorship who didn't live through it, who are going to have a different relationship to that memory.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was something that kind of moved me. Seeing the treatment of the dictatorship in a horror film, but also understanding that older generations are going to have a different relationship. Mm-hmm. So I'll tell you where I began with the project. I started one group of people that I interviewed, that was recommended to me that I interviewed, and it wasn't completely unfruitful, was to interview psychoanalyst. For complicated reasons in history, Argentina does have a history of psychoanalysis, and so I did interview 2 or 3 psychoanalysts, and one of them was alive during the dictatorship, and he was a college student. And I was asking him about these incredibly sensitive questions, and I asked his permission if it was okay if I did talk to him about these things, and he began crying during the interview, and I felt awful. I felt awful, and we stopped the interview, and I that was it. And it's one of those things. You see the human consequences of things that on paper or on film seem one way, but when you see it in the flesh, is totally different. Can be a totally different thing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was something that definitely kind of left an impression on me.
So when you were in Argentina, on the surface level, does it seem like a place where you see elements that you think, yeah, I guess they did have a dictatorship here that was brutal? Or when you're there, do you feel like, wow, I don't even see how, I don't see it. I don't see the dictatorship elements, remaining.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, when you're there, it's not everywhere, there are memorials, mm-hmm. and so for instance, a lot of the torture centers that were operating, if they had not been bulldozed, then they've become what are called, I guess the English translation would be memory centers, and we're almost museums where people can go. But yeah, I mean, it's that's a fascinating question. You know, it's a culture that in some ways has moved on, but you can't expect it all to move on. You know, that would be unfair. There are still wounds and there are still things going on, and it's something that I have never encountered before in the United States, but I have encountered in other countries where there has been a dictatorship. So let me see if I can try to encapsulate it by kind of telling two or three different things. But you know, it's one time I got on the bus and a woman, an older woman, she helped pay for my bus ticket because all the businesses were closed and I couldn't get change anywhere. And extremely nice woman, and we're riding on the bus, and I'm actually riding somewhere to do an interview, and she's talking to me, and we're going through a forest section of Buenos Aires, and she says to me, I guess the English translation would be something like, things were better when the gentlemen were in charge. And the gentlemen she was referring to for the military officers. You know, it's just, so you have an instance of someone, and it's not completely unheard of people liking a brutal dictatorship to be in charge. And then also, this kind of gets back to the films, and this is something that did really surprise me a lot, is that with the number of Argentine films, and again, not just horror films, but given the number of Argentine films that deal with the dictatorship, there can be a dynamic of, how do we say this, like memory saturation. that people are sick of seeing the dictatorship, or films about the dictatorship. That was something that surprised me. And in fact, a number of these horror film directors saw their films as a way of getting away from a realist cinema, or a cinema that deals with political tragedy all the time. So that was something that was interesting for me. But getting kind of more concretely back to your question, like, yeah, you can find memory centers sometimes in particular cities. One time in a particular part of the capital, I came across an overpass that was left undone because while they were building the overpass, they found a mass grave. And they just stopped building it. And that's just like, holy cow. And it's not a gigantic memorial, it was just left undone. And you can see placards and people have put up. But that's kind of a thing that's there. It's not everywhere, but at the same time, it's by no means non-existent. Short. So yeah. So
something that came to mind was that, you know, like here in the U.S., people who are into scary films, let's say, or horror, they'll see a graveyard or an old abandoned building, and they might get this reaction like, ooh, there's probably, like a positive reaction to like, ooh, there's probably like a cool horror, idea going through their brain. Whereas I wonder in Argentina, I guess, I assume they get the same, they like, if you're into horror there, you like graveyards and old dark places, but then you also have this extra layer of like brutality that occurred, decades back. So I'm just curious about that kind of interplay of,
Yeah, and it's something that I was interested in. I look at the chat rooms and discussions about the films, and folks, when they talk about a horror film, oftentimes they don't talk about the legacy of the dictatorship unless the film is explicitly about it. So that's something that I kind of deal with in the book is how do you shut that out? Can you shut that out, or is it me projecting onto the movies that hey you guys, how can you not think about this? So it's just yeah, it's a paradox. It's a paradox.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's definitely layers. So, yeah.
So, what do you hope, apart from just opening more people's eyes to Argentine horror cinema, what do you hope the book will do?
I hope that, I guess one way is, I hope if people don't already appreciate low-budget filmmaking, that they might. So I think oftentimes people conceive of cinema as strictly the movies that are in multiplexes or on Netflix or on Redbox or something, and it's important, I think, to understand that kind of cycles of cinema can also happen on a low-budget scale. So in this case, the horror films, they got started on a very low-budget scale, and now they've progressed to kind of a commercial phase, but at the same time, there's still filmmakers who are making movies for kind of shoestring budget.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's one thing is, consider different ways of filmmaking and different modes of filmmaking and distribution, because it goes without saying, everybody already knows this, but film viewing doesn't happen just in theaters these days, and filmmaking just doesn't happen in big studios these days. So,
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, can you speak to any additional difficulties you had in finishing and getting the book published? You mentioned a few already.
One thing that came up was with the punk horror films is I was trying to get film stills, and the quality of images are so poor that when I would take a still and try to correct it with Photoshop or something, you can only do so much correction. But I went with the poor image because that's part of the punkness of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's definitely not corporate punk. So it's got that raw element to it.
Uh-huh.
Other difficult things, I guess a steady diet of horror cinema. I don't, I can only imagine. Of course, there are all kinds of different horror cinema fans out there, and I imagine they watch a variety of different movies. I don't know if anyone exists on a pure diet of horror cinema,
mm-hmm.
but for the sake of writing this book, I was on a steady diet of it, and after a while, eventually it can wear on you a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure you bounce it out with some screwball comedies. But yeah, it was kind of a something to be endured, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Sacrifice for the art for.
Yeah, well put.
So, what's your next writing project?
Oh man, well, we'll see. One project I was starting to look at was the number of shows and movies about drug trafficking, and about trafficking in general. So I just think looking at things on that is available on Netflix, but it just seems to be like this explosion. And it's not new by any means, of movies that deal with traffic. So, of course, drug trafficking, but also arms trafficking, human trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
And, I wrote a book on a horror genre. And I think that given the number of movies that are, and television or series, actually, I don't know what you would call now, streaming series, that deal with traffic, that there's a traffic genre now. And looking at all these different movies is, would be a huge undertaking, and I don't know how we'll do it except for just sitting down and watching all this stuff. But how does one film traffic? If traffic is the circulation of illicit products, what are the different motifs that are repeated to represent traffic? And that might be an immigrant who's upwardly mobile, like Scarface, and is there some kind of transportation that always goes into getting the stuff across the borders, like we're the Millers in an RV, or tunnels like weeds. So that's something that kind of interests me. I've written something recently about Horus Center from Chile, and so yeah, those are kind of the things that are on the front and back burners, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So people can find the book on Amazon. Do you have a website or social media accounts that people can follow you on?
I don't, I'm afraid. Maybe I can work on that. I was going to say those. The book is expensive. We'll see what happens in a year if there's a different edition that comes out. But if you go on the publisher's website, SUNY, SUNY, SUNY Press, and type in the title, folks will see the book available there if they want to order it. But also, people can read the first chapter to see if it's interesting to them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's all the questions I have. Any final words?
No, just thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thanks to folks for listening.
All right, thank you. Thank you for listening. One of the best ways in which you can provide feedback for this podcast is to rate me on iTunes. Please give me a good rating if you like this, or feel free to give me a bad rating if you didn't, and I'll use that feedback to hopefully make this a better podcast. You can also follow me on Instagram under Chris Alvarez Sci-Fi, on Facebook under Chris Alvarez WLC, on YouTube under Chris Alvarez WLC, and on Twitter under Chris Alvarez WLC. You can also get more information on my website, chrisalvarez.com. Please remember my name Chris does not have an H, so it's ChrisAlvarez.com. Thanks for listening, and keep imagining the future.